Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about a topic that gets brought up and people misrepresent it when I say it. Because I'll say things like this and people will step in and say, so you're saying we can ignore progressive overload as long as we're close to failure on sets and so on and so forth. And it's like, well, no, you can't ignore progressive overload, but progressive overload is going to be something you can't force. Once you're out of the novice phase, when we start talking about, progressive overload, it means can we add weight? Can we add reps? Can we do that with an individual set? And so when I say that we need to be there, it doesn't mean that we can ignore progressive overload. In other words, if we are training relatively hard and we are seeing muscle growth, there's going to be progressive overload if we're taking sets close to failure. And again, I want to be clear, I do not promote training to failure, right? I don't promote training to failure. I usually recommend being, within a couple reps, 2 or 3 reps of failure, maybe 1 on some cases, particularly last sets, and that's perfectly reasonable. But we also need to remember this is for all your accessory work. We're usually doing other stuff first, right? We're tending to do either, heavy singles for training maxes. We're doing speed work first, right? Which we care more about bar speed than sometimes in mechanical tension and overload. We're doing heavy AMRAPs, things like that before we do all this other training volume, the training volume that we then use to thicken everything up and fill in the gaps. So when you understand it from that context, then we step in and look at it. Because I want to be very clear, I'm not telling people to come in and do, 3 sets of 10 on 6 exercises and go home. Okay? It's not what I advocate. That's not how I program. So if you're interpreting it that way, you have no idea what I do on my channel. You haven't watched my client vlogs. You haven't watched my training vlogs. You haven't, looked at what I promote. Okay, so that little bit aside, let's talk a little bit about the progressive overload being built in. And there should just be a general upward trend. In other words, all of our hypertrophy work that we're thinking of in this regard is our secondary work, right? It's usually stuff we're doing afterwards. We tend to be doing things like 10s or 12s and things like that for our reps for it. And I'm not saying that's always the case. There are cases where we go higher and lower, but, ballpark. So what I would point out there is that if you're training fairly hard, if you start with something that is really even your 15 rep max and you're doing 3 sets of 10 and you're, that's a little bit weak. You should probably be pushing a hair harder than that if you're trying to maximize, hypertrophy, but you'll get there quickly. So if you grab that weight and you start simply trying to get closer to failure, you're going to add reps by default. Okay. And if you're able to add reps, then that is progressive overload. And that's what I mean. We should see a general upward trend there. Okay? And, a person could look at that and say, well, when I get to a certain number of reps, I'm going to add weight. Depending upon what they have for increments available. If you have micro plates and barbells for these things, it's very easy to just say, I got 11 or 12 reps, I can add weight. If you're trying to do 10s, for example, on the last set. But if you're using dumbbells with fixed increments and you're using smaller weights and you have to do bigger jumps, maybe you're doing 20-pound dumbbells and your smallest jumps are 2.5-pound dumbbells. Well, it makes sense then that you may want to wait till you can get to sets of 14 or 15 before you grab the next dumbbell up and try to do 10s. Okay, but the point is, you're not focusing on planned progression as in I'm going to add this amount of weight this week. Okay, that's what we mean by you don't have to focus on progressive overload as long as you're generating enough fatigue with appropriate volumes and appropriate tensions. And sets are relatively hard. Okay, and we have to be clear there with that too. We mean relatively hard, meaning, within a couple reps of failure. 2 or 3 reps of failure. That's training fairly hard. Hey, that is what is necessary to stimulate good muscle growth, right? Stimulate good adaptations. Going to failure itself doesn't have benefits. So there's no point in it other than to beat yourself up and to feel like you're hardcore. So the idea here is that as long as there's an upward trend there, we're good. In other words, if you can add reps routinely, here or there, great. And when we get to a certain number of reps, if you want to add some weight, hey, great. That's what we mean by not focusing on progressive overload. Progressive overload would say, I'm going to add 5 pounds to this exercise every single week and keep trying to get the same reps, which you may be able to do, especially if it's a newer exercise that you haven't adapted to. And that's a viable method too, to rotate exercises fairly often. Okay, particularly for the advanced lifter, the rotating movements often enough to avoid overuse, maybe get a novel training response here or there. Okay, that works. But outside of doing pretty quick rotations, your weights are not going to go up quickly. Your reps are not going to go up quickly on your supplemental lifts. It may take you 4 or 6 months to add 5 or 10% weight for the same number of reps. Well, in that case, you can't be obsessed with progression on it, because you're not going to get significant progressive overload in the sense of adding weight every week to those movements. You're just probably not. And if you are, then hey, great, you've either been sandbagging or it's a new movement you rotated in. But again, as long as we're training, fairly hard there, we're good. Now, here's the question that comes up. People will then go, well, what happens if I can't? What happens if I start hitting failure when I try to add reps at all to these movements? It's like, well, at that point, there's a problem with your programming, and you know that you're not gaining muscle. Let's come back over to the point of muscle growth. We could debate really with our rep work like that, whether adding weight to the bar or adding reps is what causes muscle growth, or if it's evidence of muscle growth. And I think a good case could be made for the fact that it's evidence of muscle growth. So if you can't improve anywhere ever, you're just simply not getting bigger. And it's time to address what's going on with your training. So if you're doing multiple sets of an exercise close to failure like that, which is the case, you can't add reps anymore, you're clearly doing that. You're clearly stimulating the muscle. Make sure you're not doing too much. Right? Make sure you're not doing too much. I mean, in theory, you could make sure you're not doing too little, but the problem with too little is just that we grow slower, not that we don't grow at all. Whereas in too much can completely stop growth. All right? You got to look at those things. Look at your sleep, look at your nutrition. Are these things conducive to gaining muscle? And if they're not, if you're honest with yourself and you look at those things and say, hey, they're not conducive to gaining muscle, it's not lack of progressive overload that got you, it's under recovery that got you. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.